From the Daily Reporter, this is Ethan Duran. Welcome to Brews and Blueprints, a podcast about construction and development across Wisconsin. I'm Ethan Duran of the Daily Reporter, and I'm here with Tim Krueger, a wage and hour investigator with Construction Business Group. CBG is a nonprofit group that addresses management and labor issues and monitors projects to ensure they follow fair contract laws. The group also works in policy and education. We'll learn a little more about what they do in this episode. Tim, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate being here and giving you and your listeners an opportunity to learn a little bit more about Construction Business Group.
Tell me more about CBG and your role.
Sure. Well, first, CBG, Construction Business Group, was started back right around 1992 as an effort to work on both joint labor and management issues. So when we talk about labor, we're talking about, whether it be workers on construction site, that includes both union and non-union, but then the management of construction companies. And the management of construction companies, their host of issues are much more expansive than just the work that gets done. They have people that they have to hire. They have employees. They have all of the, what I call, and when we teach this, I emphasize the business side of construction. So when you think of our name, Construction Business Group, we're focused on all aspects of construction and the idea that construction is a business. And because of that, there are various components of both government and the private industry that have to work together to make sure that everything is proceeding the way people would like it to. So, for example, the state of Wisconsin, through the Department of Transportation, they're really concerned about our transportation systems in the state. So they have a significant interest in how construction companies who do that type of work, how successful they are and how they can be available for when road construction has to happen. And when you drill down into all of those different components, both from the government perspective and the private industry perspective, there's just a ton of issues in business that really become important and relevant. So Construction Business Group, again, we were started in right around 1992 to really focus on a lot of those broad-based construction issues. We're not an engineering company. We're not a contractor. We don't do any of the work. Our company, we're a private nonprofit company. Our focus, though, is making sure that all sides, all facets of construction are being built up so there's equity and fairness in the construction industry for everyone. So that's the general genesis of where Construction Business Group started. And, that mission has changed over the years. If you go back to 2017, the state of Wisconsin got rid of prevailing wage. That impacted some of the things that we do at CBG. So my position, I'm one of 8 wage and hour investigators around the state, and that title is intended to, focus on employees and wages and hours. But our focus as an investigator is a lot more than just that. It's focused on those different aspects and facets of construction, including, wages and hours, obviously, but, benefits, the bidding process, if you're a local or county or a state government entity, to make sure that they're doing the type of bidding that's required by statute. So we look into and we follow all of those things to make sure that all aspects of that contract are being done correctly. So as a wage and hour investigator, it's kind of narrow in what the title is, but it's more expansive really when we actually get into the field and start doing some of that investigative work.
For those that don't know, could we go over that piece of legislation in 2017 on prevailing wage and how it sort of changed the construction business environment?
Sure, absolutely. So Wisconsin, and I don't know the breakdown across the United States of how many states still have prevailing wage. But in 2017, there were actually two acts. One act got rid of prevailing wage in the private sector, and then another act that was passed by the state of Wisconsin got rid of prevailing wage at the state government level. Interesting enough, the federal government still has prevailing wage. The federal government prevailing wage was passed in 1931 under an act that's called the Davis-Bacon Act. Two legislators named Davis and Bacon were instrumental in getting that act passed. That is still relevant and it still does apply to federally funded projects in the state of Wisconsin. There is a breakdown which, we could probably look at. I don't know the numbers, but, there's a fair amount of federal money that still comes into the state of Wisconsin. So those projects, would have prevailing wage. So in 2017, the prevailing wage was rescinded, and that means that any contractor who's bidding on a project can pay their employees anything that they would like. They have to be above the minimum wage, but there's no longer like a trade specific wage that the contractors have to pay. So if I am a laborer, I can be paid $12 an hour, and that would be now appropriate in the state of Wisconsin. When there was prevailing wage, that number probably would have been much higher. Prevailing wage usually includes a component of the hourly wage that they have to be paid, along with a fringe or a benefit package. So let's assume for a second that a contractor does not have any kind of benefits that they pay their employees, then they have to pay that to the worker in an hourly wage. So, just for example, if the prevailing wage is $30 an hour and $15 an hour for fringes, uh, a person who doesn't get any benefits from their company would have to be paid $45 an hour. So before 2017, when Wisconsin had that, every contract for construction had a prevailing wage component to it. And now that number is much reduced only to those federal projects. So CBG, Construction Business Group, the company I work for, pre 2017, our investigators spent a lot of time just pursuing contractors who were not um, properly paying the prevailing wage. Let me give you a quick example. I was hired in 2019. Before I arrived, there was a contractor in the Madison area who was not paying their employees properly. Um, the case that was sent in to DWD, that's the Division of Workforce Development at the state of Wisconsin, was for almost a quarter of $1 million of wages that was not properly paid to their employees. A contractor who doesn't pay the prevailing wage, if there is a wage set, is basically cheating. Well, the number one, they're cheating their employees because they're not paying them appropriately. But then number two, they're also cheating any other contractors who bid on that project. If it's a government project and and the prevailing wage is $30 an hour with 15 is a fringe, and you're paying $20 and you're not giving any benefits, you've just made a considerable savings as that contractor. So the prevailing wage compliance is a component of what we look for. Again, we're trying to make sure that there's fairness and equity in all of the bids and projects that are taking place. So for whatever reason, probably a little bit of a political reason based upon who was in office at the time in 2017, the prevailing wage was rescinded. So now Wisconsin has no requirement for a prevailing wage unless it is on those federal jobs. And one of the outcomes of that is that now we can see contractors coming in from out of state. That's one of the negative drawbacks of not having a prevailing wage. We have seen, and we continue to see, companies coming in from other states um, because they're going to be able to do that work a lot cheaper. If you're a laborer or contractor down in a southern state that has a pretty low hourly rate that they generally pay, you can send your employees up to Wisconsin and still underbid local contractors. So now that creates a whole host of issues, and it's a it's an ongoing like problem that develops when you have an out of state contractor coming into Wisconsin. They're paying their wages that are much cheaper, but oftentimes those companies don't come into Wisconsin. They're not properly registered to work here through DFI. There's a whole mechanism that the state of Wisconsin uses to collect taxes from those companies. So if you think about a transient company coming in from, we'll say, Tennessee, or it could be any state. They come up to Wisconsin, run a couple contracts, maybe through a summer. It's really nice in Wisconsin in the summer, not as hot as it is down south. So they come up here, they work for 4, 6 months, grab all the wages, all the, whatever they earn for that contract, and then they take that money and they send their employees back home and leave the state. And then the state of Wisconsin doesn't collect the taxes that should have been collected here. In addition, another side note to that is, you have many contractors in Wisconsin who could have benefited Wisconsin residents by having their employees working on that job. So again, those are cascading issues that happen when prevailing wage was rescinded. And we continue to see that. And those are things that we as investigators are constantly looking for.
I was going to follow up, after 2017, where has your team shifted its focus? What's an ongoing issue right now that you've seems to rise above all the other issues in construction right now that your team has paid attention to?
Well, I'll answer this. There's actually a couple different things. Number one, shortly after I was hired, or maybe even before I was hired, when Governor Evers came into office, he established what was called at that time a misclassification task force. So misclassification is another way that the construction industry, and it happens in other industries too, kind of skirts employment laws. So misclassification happens when a employee who should be classified as an employee is not, and instead they're treated as an independent contractor. From that, again, there's a whole series of cascading issues that begin to happen. An independent contractor, it can be a real thing. There are companies. We'll use you as an example. Let's say, Ethan, you start your own painting company, and you have your business started. You're registered in Wisconsin, and you are a legitimate painting company. Um, if someone else wants to hire you to work for them, they can do that. But you're truly an independent contractor. You get to pick when you are going to go do the work. Now, they may have some parameters, but they don't dictate your day to day hourly schedule. Um, there's a whole host of other issues that come into play with independent contractors. Are you making a true independent business decision about the work you do and all these kinds of things? Are you earning a living doing this? There's actually a 9 step test to determine if a person is truly independent or if they are should be an employee. So when people get misclassified, uh, oftentimes it's with the intent that the um, company doing the misclassification, number one, they don't have to pay all the required taxes that go along with it. An employer, when they hire an employee, they have their portion of an employee's taxes that they also have to pay, whether it be Social Security, some of the income taxes and things like that. So a contractor is avoiding paying some of those types of taxes. And again, that's a cost savings to them by misclassifying that employee. The other thing that happens with an independent contractor is they have to have their own insurance. So for Ethan's painting company, he's going to have both. insurance that covers the company. But let's say you have some people that work for you, you're going to have workers' comp to cover them to make sure that they're protected if there's an injury on the site. So another reason to misclassify is you don't have to pay for that workers' comp insurance coverage for those employees because they're technically not yours, or you're claiming they're not yours. Again, Governor Evers started a task force. The task force worked for several years, and they came forward with recommendations. And I believe they're in implementation of that proposal, or many of those proposals now. But that's been an ongoing topic that continues to be a concern today. Um, and what we've seen in the type of work that we do as investigators is that there are some really big people who misclassify. And there's business models that are created with that in mind. Along with the misclassification comes the whole payment system. And one of the things that we've seen with this is where labor brokers go out and they hire people to do jobs. The labor broker themselves is not even truly a person who does any of the work. And this, as long as I've been with CBG, pushing 5.5 years, labor brokers have been a significant problem. And it incorporates misclassification, but it incorporates other kinds of issues as well. Simply how the payments are made. A lot of people talk often about wanting to work like under the table or get paid under the table, meaning um, that instead of getting a paycheck, they're just paid in cash. It's a way to avoid government taxes, to avoid anyone tracking you. So, along with the misclassification, you have labor brokers, and labor brokers will again they'll misclassify, but they oftentimes will take a cut of the money that's being earned by the people. So again, here's an example. Let's say you have a pretty large development. You could have a drywall contract as a part of a large construction. That's worth $500,000 or $1 million. Just to get all the drywall work done. And labor brokers, so let's say you and instead of painting, we'll have you do drywall. You hire me to come in and work for you doing drywall. And, the method of payment that you're paying for is maybe by the sheet of drywall. It could be so much per day. Um, but because you helped me get that work, at the end of the work week, let's say I'm supposed to earn $1,000, you're going to take a cut of that. So the contractor who owns the contract pays you because you're the labor broker. They're paying you that $1,000, but instead of you paying that $1,000 to me, the guy who did the work, you're going to take your cut, which can be 10 or 15%. And tracking down all of this hidden money in this system is significantly challenging. It's challenging for us as investigators, and then the government oversight agencies also struggle to track this down, and who's doing what. But we have had some success with labor brokers and the misclassification that they're doing. But those are continuous. Those are a couple of the larger issues that we are seeing regularly. Going back to your question was, what are some of the bigger issues? So those are two of the bigger issues. And then we also have, the out-of-state contractors who come into the state. I call them transient. They come in for a short amount of time and then they leave. A good example of that, back in 2018, in the city of Sun Prairie, they were doing some utility installation in the downtown area. Um, when that work was getting done, there was a boring machine that was being used. The boring machine was being operated by a company from out of state. They were from the state of Michigan, but they weren't the holder of the contract. They were a subcontractor. But they didn't necessarily have all the required, registrations and things happening here in Wisconsin. In that particular case, that in 2018, they compromised a gas line, and it was a main. So a gas main has, a significant amount of gas running through it. The compromise happens. Um, the end result is, as many people who will remember, was an explosion in downtown Sun Prairie. It was a significant explosion. There was a firefighter who worked for the Sun Prairie Fire Department who was killed in that explosion. He actually worked. He had a business downtown. It was his own bar, but he was also on the fire department. And when the gas line was compromised, they paged out the fire department, and he then responded as a fire department member. And he was actually in his own bar when that detonation took place, um, and he lost his life. The company that was doing the work, they were identified, but within a short amount of time, they left the state. The state of Wisconsin did their investigation, and I don't know the exact number, but there was a fine that was assessed to them based upon some of these problems that were happening as a part of the contract and things like that. I Last I heard, and it's been a little while, but that company never paid that fine. And as we've seen in multiple occasions, it's very easy for a company like that just to leave the state. And then in this particular case, we found that company coming back into the state, but they had a change in name. We found some of the same people who admitted that they were in Sun Prairie. So, they have this accident that results in a death of a firefighter. They leave the state, they don't pay the fine, and then we find them back working in Wisconsin again. It's another community, same people, just under a different umbrella, a different name. Um, so those kinds of things are frustrating. So we are constantly, as investigators, and again, going back to your question was, what are some of the big issues? We're constantly looking for this kind of stuff where out-of-state companies, if they do run into problems here in Wisconsin, if they do have enforcement action taken against them, they change the shingle name and then they, work their way back again. And it's just kind of like this repetitive cycle. Within a short amount of time, after that incident in Sun Prairie, and I was not working here for CBG when that Sun Prairie explosion happened. I was still active in law enforcement. I was a full-time police officer, so I was actually in Sun Prairie that night that the incident happened. After I got hired here, there was another gas line compromised across from an elementary school down in McFarland. Um, and one of the problems that happens is some of these things in construction happen, but the local municipal government doesn't, put all of their resources into investigating and trying to get to the bottom of what happened. And that was exactly what I found in McFarland. The day after, I started asking some questions, and I had contacts in local government, and they weren't aware of all the problems that were happening. That McFarland case, there were 5 subcontractors working for a general contractor, and all of those entities were from out of state. All of them had numerous different levels of issues with their registrations or their lack of workers' comp and things like that. Um, Last year, we hired another investigator who came out of the Milwaukee Police Department, and she's an expert in human trafficking. So we've started to turn some of our attention towards human trafficking in the construction industry. So if you think about some of the things I've already described, let's say it's a company coming up from a state down south. So Ethan's painting company, but let's say again, you're doing drywall or you're doing utility installation, and you bring a group of 8 guys up from Louisiana, um, and you bring them up here and you house them and you feed them, but they don't have their own transportation, and you're maybe withholding their paycheck to kind of hold them as a captive employee. So that's a version, a form of human trafficking that we're also spending some time now trying to get our hands wrapped around. So the newer investigator we just brought on, she's one of the state's leading experts. She had worked for Milwaukee Police Department in her policing career, and so she's really kind of focusing on that aspect of construction as well with human trafficking. From the state's perspective, the Attorney General, Josh Call, he has put that as one of his priorities, that he really is interested and really wants to pursue some cases that have human trafficking as a component, and in particular with construction, but just in general. So I know they have some investigators at the state level who also work on human trafficking issues. We're just hoping to bring some cases forward to them as options for them to pursue as well.
That's quite the plate of problems right there, the industry faces. Can you tell me a bit about when you receive a complaint about worker misclassification, can you break down the steps of how you investigate that and how you work towards a result where worker recovers the full wages that they're owed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me start first by just giving a little bit of background. So I spent 30 years in law enforcement. When I retired, I was a police chief for a smaller policing agency, and seven of our eight investigators are former retired law enforcement officers. Some were detectives, some were in administration, such as myself. But in a smaller agency, we end up doing, investigations all the time. So our background is really law enforcement, even though like us now today, we have no government authority. We're a private nonprofit. We don't have true enforcement capability. We can only grab information and data and then send it to the state or federal agencies who are responsible. So with that backdrop, just keep in mind, like when we get a complaint of something, we're doing as thorough of an investigation as we can. So generally, we're going to have some indication of the company who's involved. So um, now, even though we're not police officers anymore, we are private investigators. We are, as investigators, we have a license by the state of Wisconsin as private investigators. So we do have access to some data systems that investigators, private investigators use to help like learn information, whether it be about individuals or about businesses and so on. And then there are state resources that are available for us to use, databases. So the DFI, Department of Financial, DFI, they have a database where you can search to see if companies are registered in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin for workers' comp at DWD, Division of Workforce Development. They have a website where you can look, anyone can search to see if a contractor has a workers' comp policy. So, if you think about like when you're going to do any type of an investigation, information is what really drives it. We need information. First of all, is there a problem? Maybe there is a complaint, but it's not a legitimate complaint. So, we have to do our due diligence in our background to find out what the issues are, if they're legitimate. Um, a component we always reserve the right to do is go talk to people. If Ethan's company has workers, a lot of times those workers, in some cases, may be dissatisfied. They may be willing to share information or talk to us about, what their benefits are or what their status is in terms of misclassified or maybe as an employee. They'll tell us how they get paid, if they get a paycheck or if they're paid in cash. They'll tell us if they have the required taxes taken off of their paycheck. So, we go out and we'll find people. We'll maybe find them at a work site or we'll contact them. We try not to bother them at work. Sometimes we may have to, or at least find them at the workplace. But we'll just try and, have a quick conversation with them. And usually within a small number of questions, we can find out if that person's going to be helpful, if they want to talk to us, or maybe they don't want to talk to us. But we try and make it worth, if you think about a person who's being screwed over in some way, whether they're not getting all their wages, maybe they're not getting overtime or they're not getting travel time or, any of those numerous things. If a person feels like they're getting screwed over, they're much more willing to talk about it and be able to, give information about what's happening. So we try and find, a lot of that stuff and look for the proper angle that we can really come and talk to people about it. So again, we do our due diligence, look at the company, look at the workers, understand the structure, look for past violations. The other thing that we often will look at in Wisconsin is CCAP. You see legitimate court cases that exist out there. Also, CBG, we have a couple of our own databases. One database is internal, where we manage all of our reports that we write and we manage all this data. But we have another database that we use to help kind of track contractors. And, we call it our bidder database, but it helps to determine companies and what kind of problems they may have. So let's say, for example, back to Ethan's company, if Ethan his company has had, 3 OSHA offenses and has been fined 3 times, we'll track all of those and we'll incorporate that into that database. If there were court cases, you can find those on CCAP, or if there was no workers' comp, we'll have, in fact, we have about 15 or 16 different metrics that we use for we're up to almost 14 or 15,000 companies in the state of Wisconsin. And we research, those different standards on each company at least once a year and update that so it's current. So, we'll use our own database to go look and see what issues may exist out there for that company. And then, based upon all of the investigation that we do, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, is we have to forward that information, that case, to the state or the federal agencies who have responsibility over the particular issues that we found. So if it's a company that's not registered in Wisconsin and they could be avoiding, paying taxes, we will send that. It's called a third party, complaint. We send that as a third party complainant to the required agencies. So in this case, it would be the Department of Revenue for the state of Wisconsin, but we've worked directly with the IRS at the federal level for some larger cases. And I know in the past we've talked about this case with Gustavo Reyes. He had his own issues with the IRS, and he's spending some time in federal prison right now. That was a case that was started back in 2014, 15, and it took that long to build everything together. But that's a good example of us using the IRS. So if you think about all the different kinds of regulatory investigative agencies, so at the state of Wisconsin, you have DWD, you've got the DOR, you've got DWD workers comp, and then there's other minor violations. Sometimes we find trucks that aren't properly registered with their DOT number, so we may contact law enforcement and go, "Hey, these guys are operating illegally." Again, just trying to make sure all of the various angles are being complied with the laws. Um, and then at the federal level, you have the Department of Labor. So if you have overtime issues, if you have pay issues, then we'll work directly with them. So a little bit ago, you had asked about, if you have people with wages. So in the state of Wisconsin, employees can file a wage complaint with the Division of Workforce Development with DWD. Um, One of the things that we do, so again, if Ethan, if you're the employee and if you haven't been paid for some of your wages, we will help you directly to file that wage complaint paperwork. Um, Again, this is not reflective of people in construction, but a lot of these, again, the industry is a large part men, but it's not all men. But a lot of the people in construction aren't going to take the time to fill out state paperwork for a wage complaint. So when we identify that as an issue, we'll work directly with that person to gather the information, to fill out the paperwork. It's a 4-page document you have to fill out, give all the detail, why they believe they're entitled to extra wages and all this kind of stuff. And we'll do all the work to fill it out, and then we send it in on their behalf. Um, so that's a regular thing that we do, helping workers try and recover wages or money that's still owed to them by their employees. A little bit earlier, I mentioned this company that was the wage complaint ended up being almost $250,000. That company had to pay $11,000 a month to help get that paid off over, I think it was like 2 to 3 years. When I started, I was contacted by a few of the workers who were getting a portion of that money because there were some payments that were late, they weren't coming in. So, we stayed engaged after the fact, but that's an example of where, you know, that $250,000 is money. And for even for a company to have to pay that, and that's why the state allowed them to pay that over a number of years. Some smaller wage complaints I've had have been like as like an award recently was, like 1,900 $1,900, but I've had some in the double digit range as well, where it's, 15 to $20,000 that employees were able to get back. So, um, in those cases, again, we're doing the legwork, we're working with the employee, we send it in, then we track that case all the way through, continuing to provide them, not we don't give legal guidance, we're just, like, I guess we would serve as an advocate for those workers and making sure that they're made whole from all those, theft of their wages. And then a side note, we you mentioned it a little bit in the intro, but we also do education, and I'll talk more about that in a little while. But we also hold the state's feet to the fire. So let me give you an example. There was a young man who had a company. It was named after himself, but there was another company with almost the exact same name. It's another dude, right? Another dude with the same name, and they each had a same name company. Well, um, there was a worker comp injury at a site, in the state assigned the workers' comp debt to the wrong company, and they asked if, we would look into it. So in looking that case over, we were able to prove that the state assigned the $20,000, almost $20,000 debt to the wrong person. So we were able to get that cleared off for that person. Similar to a wage complaint, we saved that dude 20 grand. But in that case, we also had to hold the feet of the state to the fire and say, hey, you guys screwed this up. So again, those are just a couple of examples.
Gustavo Reyes case, which I believe the Daily Reporter had a story about that when he was sentenced to federal prison, as you mentioned. Um, were you in charge of investigating Reyes? What was that case like? I think when you spoke for DC 7 not too long ago at their conference in Sheboygan, I think you mentioned something about helping him get a truck back. Um, tell us a little bit about that story.
Sure. Well, first of all, the Gustavo Reyes case was started back in 2014 and 15, and I didn't start with CBG till 2019. So when I came on board, I took over the Madison area, which is where his general base of operation was. So when I came on board, yeah, I mean, I was told about him. I did my research on, previous, data and information that we had about him. And then, I had to pick up the mantle and kind of carry it. So I was directly involved, and that includes, looking for the companies that he was using, the subs that he was using, trying to find inroads on what their systems look like, how they met, where they met, the money that was paid or not paid. Um, One of our other investigators, he's now retired as well, Victor Centeno. Victor was also he was out of the Milwaukee area, but he spent a lot of time working on Gustavo, as well. So, my investigation, it included all kinds of things that I was doing. We do a lot of surveillance. To get information, we just have to sometimes watch and see what's going on. So, you know, even as simple as like driving by his house just to see what kind of vehicles are there or who's around and, all that kind of stuff. So, and then for us, it's trying to stay current by giving information to those agencies who do have oversight. So, information we're gathering, we're continually feeding that back to those, whether it be state or federal agencies. And the one of the problems we struggle with as investigators is it's not a two-way street. Those agencies can't tell us anything about what's going on. So we don't know. We keep feeding them information and, cases, but we don't get the privy of what they're actually working on. And then in the case of Gustavo, he gets kind of summonsed in the early, 2022, 23. He starts having, these legal issues to the point where he was actually sentenced back in 2023. Um, that can be frustrating sometimes, but we just keep working. We have to believe that at some point, the things will catch on. But really, I would say the majority of his case was IRS related. I think there were things that the state of Wisconsin could have looked at and probably should have looked at with Gustavo, but it fell in the hands of the IRS. And when you look at, and I think I've read the article that you guys did on that. There was a lot of money that he still owed and still owes to this day. That they really became the focus. So they did their due diligence. And then, as a side note, Gustavo had a variety of other issues as well. There was a drug charge locally in the Dane County area. There were some other tax warrant issues, through the state and other state agencies. So his was really an accumulation of a variety of different issues. So, all right, so let's get to the vehicle, the truck that we, we helped him recover. So this was kind of a weird thing, I'll describe it to you like this: like if I'm not a, like, mafioso kind of person, but, you have this image of people like a Gustavo, like, "Oh my gosh, are they the mafia? And, how connected are they?" And they become like this personality and this cult that's just, like, bigger than life in some ways. Um, and I never had direct personal contact with Gustavo during the years that I was working on his case. It was just kinda all, data and then, background and other stuff. And then out of the blue, I got a phone message from him. He just called me and left me a phone message. How he got my name and number, I don't know. I didn't ask him that. But he called me and he's looking for help. And he, had a vehicle that he owned that, he was, I guess, in conflict with another company, and that company had taken his truck and they were keeping it. They were now giving it back to him. That's what he had called for. By this point, he had his IRS issues. He was already in the court process. And I think he was really preparing himself, for, what was probably coming down the pike, which was, uh, most likely going to be sentenced to some period of time in federal prison. So he's trying to get all his assets together. And so he called me, and, he had some English as a second language issues. So, Victor, the other investigator who worked with us on this case, he's Spanish speaking. So, we actually had Victor and Gustavo get together, to kinda talk through what the issues were. And what ended up happening, at CBG, even though for a number of years, Gustavo was, a target and was, not paying correctly, taking a cut, doing all these tax things. He needed our help, and we, obliged him, and we helped him, just like we try to be fair with everyone. We wanna do what's right, and in this case, we felt like his, truck was being withheld from him. So we worked with some local law enforcement agencies and, to help recover his truck for him. Um, and that kinda led down, in the lead up to his period of incarceration where, we spent some time, and Victor spent a fair amount of time just talking to him and, trying to understand more about his system and how it worked. Again, when you're doing an investigation, any person in the investigation can have information. And when you get to a, I'll call it like a kingpin, like a Gustavo was, just to be able to sit and pick his mind about what he does, how he does it, and how it works, that can be very helpful for us as investigators to understand the system and maybe give us different ways that we can look at investigating it as well. So
So in a way, it helps pay off for the future investigations, it sounds like.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a thing, and it didn't take me long in law enforcement to realize that sometimes as a police officer, as a cop, you've got to go out and you've got to talk to some people who commit crimes, and you're learning their ways and means of how they do their stuff. Um, it doesn't always mean that it has to be a contentious relationship. Even people who commit crimes, they can be funny. They can have a good side to them as well. They're not a person I'm going to spend a lot of time with outside of a work environment. But I will pick your brain. I'll use your information to help us get better and improve our skills in what we do. So, yeah, that's how I look at all those things. You know, uh, I think Gustavo was given 18 months. We're probably halfway through his term of incarceration. He's going to be coming back out someday, and there's a good chance he's going to get back into the business again. Now, the question would be, is he going to do it legitimately or will he, pick up where he left off? And I don't know the answer to that yet. I don't know what he's doing while he's incarcerated. I don't know if somebody else is just running his business for him. It's something I've looked into a little bit. Um, but 18 months in prison, even though it's a big case, it also is not the end. He's a fairly young man yet in his 50s, so he'll be coming back out probably back into the Madison area. He Gustavo had a fair amount of contacts and had a life basically down in Mexico. um, I was actually surprised he didn't flee and just, try and go back to Mexico and never surface, period. But, he did. He stayed here. And to me, that's an indicator when he gets out, he's not heading back to Mexico. He's going to be staying in the United States. He's got family here. He's got friends here. This is where his life is. So, and when he comes out, he's going to have to, make a living. So I would guess, I'm hoping he does it legitimately and he doesn't skip out on taxes, and he's still got a lot of back taxes and things to pay. Um, but that the rest of that story isn't written yet. We'll know more in the next 3 to 5 years probably, and maybe we'll be having the same conversation, and we'll have to see where things are then, I guess. Um,
Tim, I want to ask you something that wasn't originally on the list, but you had mentioned a couple of issues with the construction industry that I feel are might be more pertinent more than ever. And so the basis of this, earlier this month we saw Donald Trump reelected for the president, as president of the United States, and with that, that carries many possible implications for the construction industry in many different ways. I know that we discussed prevailing wage for as an example, transient contractors and human trafficking, which is an issue that comes with any type of immigration. Do you see any implications in any of these areas under that could potentially arise in this new administration? I mean, I'm sure you've done your homework, and I'd love to hear your outlook on that.
yeah, well, I guess yeah, there's a political overlay to many things that happen in construction. If you look back at the most recent election, I think the Teamsters were supportive of Trump. Um, I think that was maybe caught a lot of people by surprise. What's interesting is in the construction industry, there's a constituency of people who have like a very fine interest in this particular topic having to do with construction, but they're also U.S. citizens and they're impacted by policies that aren't necessarily just related to their profession. I think there will be some impact to this. What personally it will be, I just don't know. Um, the Teamsters must have felt that it wasn't going to hurt them that much to endorse Donald Trump. Other labor organizations may have a different perspective, and they're not going to like it. And it's so hard to kind of predict what's going to happen. I've not personally heard anything like with the federal prevailing wage or anything that's in jeopardy, but I suppose it could be. There was just a legislative update to that law in the last year or so, and of course, there's always court cases changing it. Would a new administration, and they have three branches of government, will they look to make challenges or changes to policies like prevailing wage? I think it could be possible, but I've not heard that. Um, so I wish I had a an ability to forecast the future, Ethan. But I think I'm gonna have to let you down. I don't know. I think there's, there's could be impact, and some of it may not be positive for, companies and contractors. If you think about just in general where the country is financially, whether it be inflationary issues, whether it be infrastructure cost issues, all of these things kinda roll together, and you could see changes in some of the funding that was approved a few years ago. ARPA funds, things like that, maybe the new administration could make changes to that. I don't know if they will, but anything is possible at this point. And and then what's that financial impact gonna be? Big picture to the country, and then, on a more local level here in Wisconsin. You know, I guess we as a state, we get money from the federal government, but the state of Wisconsin also, especially right now with the Evers administration, is very committed to our infrastructure and making sure that we're spending a fair amount of money to get the infrastructure where it should be. Maybe after some years of neglect. Um, but the federal government has the biggest coffers around, so to see that federal potential that the federal pot could change, yeah, that's probably would have an impact. I would also say, we're also talking about that's government money, but a lot of the construction industry is private money, and it's access to capital. We do have housing issues in this country, significant housing issues going on, whether it be lack of housing, or the cost of housing. You know, uh, just for a person to rent an apartment, a single bedroom apartment, in larger cities, you could be into the, not $1,000. We're talking $2,000 or more. So that's a real problem. Um, but, I don't know what the solution is, but it's an indicator that, everything construction is not government related. There's infrastructure and utilities that we're seeing now with broadband increases, whether it be gas lines. There's a issue in the state of Wisconsin with Line 5, and should we or shouldn't we? And how do we, if we're gonna do an infrastructure like a gas line or a fuel line or something like that, how do we make that as safe as we can so we're not harming the environment? A lot of political issues and all that, but a lot of those are non-government related funded projects. So, uh, um, is there capital available for those private entities? And we're talking some really large entities, whether it be a Spectrum, a Verizon, who is trying to build out a 5G network across the state. You do have the gas lines. There's a significant gas line going right through the middle of the state here that construction will be starting soon. You know, a lot of those are all private projects. So, you know, the change in administration, was pretty resounding in the federal election. I think we're all gonna, see what the outcome of that election was, and I'll be interested to watch it just like you. Sorry, can't be more help with that one. Mm.
That's totally fine. I know that was a bit of a pivot, and I appreciate you for doing your best. Tim, we are rounding out, I think, maybe an hour now as of this recording, more than 45 minutes. I guess I want to take this moment to say thank you for being on. Was there any final remarks you had? If people want to get in touch with Construction Business Group, how can they do it? Anything else you'd like to talk about?
Just the last thing I mentioned it just briefly about our educational component. So this as we head into the slower construction season, we kind of pivot. We still do enforcement and investigations, but we're also doing education, and we spend a fair amount of time. Each investigator has a geographical area in the state, and we try and visit all the cities and villages in our areas, either in person or with an email with information and data about who we are. Um, and we also visit contractors as well, trying to give them information about things that we look into, whether it be Fair Labor Standards Act, Department of Labor issues at the state of Wisconsin issues, DWD. We'll come out, we'll talk on a variety of those issues, education wise, prevailing wage, how to make sure that you're filling out the prevailing wage paperwork correctly. So, for any of your listeners who are out there, if they have, a topic or an issue that they don't necessarily feel comfortable with, having to do with the business side of construction, if they want some guidance on issues or they want an investigator to stop in just to talk to them about things that we do, all of us are available. And anytime that they would want us to stop out. So feel free to call CBG. Our website is cbgwi.com. So if you go to that website, you can access, phone numbers and emails for all of our staff. Um, but we're a resource for anyone in construction or anyone in general government as well. And if you have questions or issues, or you want us to even know information, like let's say you're suspecting someone of something, we'll take those kinds of tips as well. So don't be afraid to reach out to us. We're here as a resource for everyone to use.
Great. Thanks again, Tim.
All right, Ethan, thanks for having me on.